U.S. envoy vows all detainees' remains will be returned. Israeli Defense Minister warns Gaza crossings will face live fire. And the Israeli Foreign Minister says Israel backs the Gaza plan, but accuses Hamas of violations.
And then, of course, we have the host tonight, and I just want to thank you very much. It was a reason we chose Egypt, because you were very helpful, and very, very helpful. Everybody wanted to have this, but we really thought it was appropriate, and you are a great leader. And he's a fantastic man and a fantastic general, by the way. But he's a great president, and I want to thank Egypt and all of your representatives for treating us all so well. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock here in Cairo. Welcome to Q News. I'm Mark Summers. U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff said he is confident all remains of detainees from Gaza will be returned, and urged a transition that prioritizes jobs, education, and strict disarmament. Witkoff told reporters the transitional phase in Gaza must include support for employment and the education sector to stabilize daily life. He also insisted on the decisive disarmament of armed groups and said they must have no future role in Gaza's governance. The envoy framed these steps as essential to securing a durable ceasefire and enabling humanitarian and reconstruction efforts across the enclave.
By the way, that's ultimately the goal here. Where President Trump is an outcome-oriented man.
Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has ordered yellow line markers to be placed inside Gaza, warning that any attempt to cross them will be met with live fire. Katz said the yellow markings define Israeli troop deployment zones within Gaza and serve as a clear boundary for movement inside the enclave. The defense minister described the move as a precaution to secure military positions and restrict civilian approach to active combat areas, as ceasefire arrangements remain fragile amid continued field tensions. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said Israel remains committed to President Trump's Gaza ceasefire plan, while accusing Hamas of breaching the agreement by retaining the remains of 19 Israeli detainees. Sa'ar claimed Israel's adherence to the Trump-brokered ceasefire, but alleged that Hamas continues to violate the terms by holding on to the bodies of 19 Israeli detainees. He warned that such actions undermine ongoing efforts to stabilize the situation and hinder progress on humanitarian arrangements under the ceasefire framework. Palestinians gathered at Nasser Hospital in Qnews to identify the bodies of relatives returned by Israel under the Egypt-US brokered ceasefire deal. Families examined photographs displayed on hospital screens, searching for traces of loved ones who had been in Israeli custody. Under the agreement proposed by President Trump, Israel was to hand over the bodies of 15 Palestinians for every deceased Israeli returned. The process continues amid deep grief and renewed calls for accountability over the treatment of detainees. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, former U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, has praised President Trump for his role in achieving the Gaza ceasefire, calling it a significant diplomatic accomplishment.
This week, after 2 years of almost unrelenting pain and loss, the Middle East offered the world a moment of hope with the return of loved ones and relief from want and from war. And I commend President Trump and his team for bringing us to this moment. But I think we all know that there's even harder work ahead, the work of rehumanization. to look past labels, tribes, hatreds, to see one another as human beings, to rediscover our shared humanity. It's work to which we must rededicate ourselves here at home as well as around the world.
US Secretary of State under Joe Biden there, Antony Blinken. Now, UNRWA Commissioner General Felipe Lazzarini said the flow of aid to Gaza must remain unrestricted for the agency and international NGOs, warning of a worsening humanitarian crisis. Lazzarini stressed that humanitarian access to Gaza should not face any restrictions as relief operations remain vital to millions of displaced civilians. Earlier, UNRWA warned that nearly all agricultural lands in Gaza have been destroyed or rendered inaccessible, describing the situation as catastrophic for food security and the livelihoods of residents. The World Health Organization says providing fuel and heavy equipment to rebuild Gaza's destroyed hospitals remains a top priority amid the ongoing ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. WHO Regional Director Hanan Balkhi stressed the urgent need to deliver medical supplies, medicines, equipment and fuel to ensure immediate relief for Palestinians. She said restoring Gaza's health infrastructure is essential to sustain emergency care and humanitarian operations. The organization is coordinating with international partners to expand access to life-saving aid, as hospitals across the enclave struggle with severe shortages and extensive damage caused by months of bombardment. Now, for more on the situation in Gaza, we go across to Hala El-Hamalawi, who's in our newsroom. Hala.
And for further analysis, we're joined from Cairo by international relations expert Dr. Mohammed Al-Tamawi. Welcome to Q News. Now, sir, Steve Witkoff says that Gaza's transition hinges on jobs, education, and decisive disarmament, particularly who enforces disarmament. How is verified on the ground, and what leverage exists if armed groups refuse?
My greetings to you and to all your viewers. Of course, the disarmament cause in Gaza is a corner for any transitional period post-war, but it's one of the most complicated, interconnected files on the security and the politics level. When Witkoff speaks or talks about disarmament, he puts a condition for any long-standing peace, but enforcing this condition entails many challenges on ground in low and political levels. And on the implementation side, there is no one party can impose disarmament inside Gaza without consensus, because Israel cannot conduct this task without being seen as occupation, which constrains any tasks. So the Palestinian Authority lacks the logistics and security to impose control on the strip. Therefore, it's likely the supervision of disarmament will be directed to an authority or a commission under supervisions of the UN, European countries, Egypt, and the US to ensure the unbiased in regards to checking our valid verification on ground, last experiences would indicate that successful disarmament entails 3 stages. One is surrendering or the arms in specific points under the supervision of internationals. Second, having a mechanism in the destructions areas under the special forces in disarmament. Third point or third stage is following up or monitoring to verify the disarmament completion.
Sir, allow me to ask you here. Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz ordered yellow line markers inside Gaza and warned of live fire if crossed. What is the legal basis for this under international humanitarian law during a ceasefire, and how will civilians and aid workers be protected from inadvertent violations?
Actually, the Israel Katz remarks entails many ground and political vagueness, which raises questions on the nature of this line. Is it the agreed upon line of gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces, or is it a new line to redraw the lines inside Gaza? The initial analysis shows that the yellow line is proposed during the ceasefire agreement and as a part of the Israeli withdrawal to withdraw to a temporary points where the withdrawal is being done. But the new in these remarks is that he connected the line to the live fire, which changes the legal status of the line. It seems Israel is trying to change it, to transfer it to a permanent security line inside Gaza, which gives it leverage inside Gaza, which contradicts Trump's plan that stipulated clearly of gradual and complete withdrawal inside Gaza. But in regards to from legal humanitarian standpoint, this line that cannot be treated as military and security line, but only temporary to facilitate aid and reconstruction and avoiding any engagement in the new transitional period, so threatening to use live fire. When exceeding this line contradicts the nature of the plan of agreement focusing on de-escalation. So this measurement has to be supervised by international commission within the framework of implementation of this agreement. But in regards to the rules of engagement, it hinges on the articles of the agreement of Sharm el-Sheikh that entails that the inability or that live fire is not allowed unless there is necessity, direct necessity or urgency to defend themselves. So Sharm el-Sheikh's agreement entails also that supporting civilians and conducting on geographical plan agreed on to have corridors, agreed on to secure mobility, to cut it short, the yellow line that the defense minister is trying to say is not Israeli innovation, but it's only part of the ground agreement that was agreed on in the Trump's plan. It's not an oppression line. So it also is connected to how much Israel is committed and complying to the rules of the agreement, and not to turn it to impose a new security reality inside Gaza.
On the detainee remains exchange, Israel alleges that Hamas retains the remains of 19 Israelis with a 15-to-1 bodies for bodies formula in President Donald Trump's agreement. So what independent verification mechanisms like the ICRC or others exist, and how do delays or disputes affect the durability of the ceasefire?
The file of detainee remains exchange between Israel and Hamas is one of the most sensitive causes post-war, not only from humanitarian angle, but also from a political and security standpoint connected to ceasefire and the understandings the memorandum of understandings agreed on in Sharm el-Sheikh summit. So the remains of 19 Israelis for soldiers, settlers killed in the last operations. Israel is depending on Donald Trump agreement, which consists of 15-to-1 bodies for bodies formula. In addition to this formula, its essence expresses, from my own point of view, is an American understanding for humanity used as a political tool more than a pure humanitarian tool. The ICRC is the most eligible authority to supervise these operations because of its experience and its experience in verification, the data and the DNA and the medical reports. However, implementing these operations cannot be done without regional international safeguards, especially from Egypt and the UN, in order to not to be transferred to a pressure card. This file exposes an indicator to the extent of commitment both parties have to this agreement.
Well, from Cairo, that was Dr. Mohammed Al-Tamawi, international relations expert. Thank you so much for joining us here on Q News, sir. Now we go back again to Mark Summers in our studio. To you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Halliday, in our newsroom. Now, coming up, airstrikes, condemnation and calls for diplomacy as Lebanon faces a new wave of cross-border escalation from Israel. Now, Lebanon's health ministry says Israeli strikes in the country's south killed 1 person and wounded 7 as responders battled a massive blaze in the village of Ansar. The Israeli military said the strikes targeted Hezbollah positions, while Lebanese President Joseph Aoun condemned them as attacks on civilian facilities and a violation of the ceasefire agreed last year. Firefighters worked through the night to contain the flames as smoke billowed over southern Lebanon. The escalation marks one of the most serious incidents since the ceasefire and raises fears of renewed cross-border tensions. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun says diplomacy, not military action, is the only path to stability, urging renewed negotiations with Israel. Aoun said the recent strikes have resulted and achieved no positive results and warned that continued hostilities threaten to undermine Lebanon's fragile security. He called for regional and international mediation to prevent further escalation and reaffirmed Lebanon's right to defend its sovereignty through diplomatic means. Iran has condemned Israel's latest airstrikes in Lebanon, calling them a blatant violation of the country's sovereignty and international law. Tehran's foreign ministry said the attacks undermine regional stability and breach the ceasefire in place since last year. Iran urged the United Nations to take immediate action, describing the strikes as reckless aggression that risks widening the conflict. Israeli forces reportedly crossed into southern Lebanon overnight, blowing up a house in the border town of Yarun. That's according to local media. Residents said troops entered the area before dawn and detonated explosives, destroying a civilian home. Lebanese officials have not confirmed the incident, but warned that any cross-border operation would constitute a serious breach of sovereignty. Tensions remain high after consecutive Israeli airstrikes across the south earlier this week. Hamas has warned that Israel's strikes in Lebanon mark a dangerous escalation and a violation of international law. In a statement, the group said the attacks on southern Lebanon show Israel's disregard for civilian life and could destabilize the region. The warning came as Lebanese rescue teams battled fires sparked by the overnight bombardment in several villages near the border. Parts of Ukraine's Kharkiv region have been plunged into darkness as rolling blackouts spread following Russian strikes on the country's energy infrastructure. Some footage from the city of Lozova show residents walking through pitch-black streets relying on generators and flashlights amid widespread power cuts. Authorities say repeated attacks have severely damaged key energy facilities, forcing emergency rationing across several regions. Ukraine's grid operator warned of longer outages as crews race to restore electricity before the temperatures drop further. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met senior U.S. officials and defense company representatives in Washington ahead of talks at the White House to request additional military support. Footage released by the Ukrainian presidency showed Zelensky meeting U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright and executives from Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. The discussions focused on defense cooperation and energy security as Kyiv seeks to strengthen its military capabilities. Zelensky is set to meet with President Trump to push for long-range Tomahawk missiles, while Washington intensifies diplomatic pressure on India and China to curb purchases of Russian oil amid the ongoing conflict with Ukraine.
On the phone, and we spoke about this so big number of attacks on our energy system.
The White House says President Trump's 2-hour phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin was very good and productive, with significant progress reported ahead of the Ukraine leader's visit to Washington. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters the conversation lasted more than 2 hours and covered key security and diplomatic issues. She said President Trump believes the call achieved great progress as discussions continue on the Ukraine conflict. When asked about Venezuela, Leavitt reiterated Trump's stance that President Nicolas Maduro leads an illegitimate regime engaged in drug trafficking, saying the U.S. is taking unprecedented steps to counter his government. The briefing comes as Washington prepares for high-level talks with Ukraine on U.S. weapons support, including Tomahawk missiles.
As early as next week, which will then be followed by a meeting very likely between President Trump and
U.S. Ambassador to Egypt, Angelina Eichhorst, says Cairo Water Week has become a major diplomatic platform for dialogue on water and sustainable development. Speaking at the closing session of Cairo Water Week, Eichhorst said the event now serves as an effective mechanism for generating innovative solutions benefiting the African continent. She added that the outcomes of the conference contribute to the fair and sustainable management of global water resources and support international efforts to strengthen cross-border cooperation in water governance. She also stressed that the event reflects Egypt's ambition to position itself as a regional hub for water information and management. Madagascar's coup leader, Colonel Michael Randrianarina, has been sworn in as president following a military takeover that ousted André Rajoelina after weeks of youth-led protests. The swearing-in ceremony was held at the High Constitutional Court in Antananarivo after the previous leader fled abroad last weekend and was later impeached by lawmakers. The African Union and UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres condemned the coup, calling for a return to constitutional power. The power shift followed weeks of Gen Z protests led by young demonstrators demanding reform and accountability, which culminated in the military seizing control earlier this week. Rajoelina has rejected the takeover and vowed not to step down despite mounting pressure and defections within the security forces. The United Nations has condemned the military takeover in Madagascar and urged an immediate return to constitutional order following the ouster of President André Rajoelina. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said he strongly condemns the unconstitutional change of government and called for the restoration of civilian-led rule and respect for the rule of law. His spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, said the UN is closely monitoring the situation and engaging regional partners to support dialogue. Kenya is holding a state funeral for the late Prime Minister Raila Odinga at Nairobi's Nyayo Stadium today, as the nation bids farewell to one of its most influential political figures. Security was tight as Odinga's body arrived at the stadium under peaceful escort, following Thursday's unrest that left 4 people dead when crowds surged to view his remains. Thousands lined Nairobi's streets in silence, waving flags and carrying flowers as the procession passed. The ceremony features full military honours, prayers by the Anglican Church of Kenya, and tributes from national and foreign dignitaries. A public viewing will follow for citizens to pay their final respects. Odinga, who died at the age of 80 while receiving treatment in India, served as Prime Minister and ran for President 5 times, leaving a lasting legacy in Kenya's political history. And just before we go, time to recap the main headlines this afternoon. US envoy vows all detainees' remains will be returned. Israeli Defense Minister warns Gaza crossings will face live fire. And the Israeli Foreign Minister says Israel backs the Gaza plan but accuses Hamas of violations. Well, thank you for joining us for our first bulletin of this afternoon. If you want more news 24 hours a day, you can follow us on our social media platforms at Qnews EGY. But stay here. In Depth is on the way next with Mona.